Hello everyone, welcome to the Melting Pot podcast. I'm your host, Dominic Monkhouse. The Melting Pot is as a result of my hunger for optimizing business performance, scaling up organizations, corporate culture, customer addiction, building high-performing teams, along with a few other obsessions along the way. I've spent the last several years working for and with some of the most successful, top-performing companies in the world. And this podcast is my attempt to synthesize what I've learned along the way to help you build a high-quality business and live a more fulfilling life. If you enjoy the podcast, you can find more information on today's episode and other topics at dominicmonkhouse.com. Today I'm talking to Nic Marks, and sometimes I talk to entrepreneurs and sometimes I talk to authors and sometimes to scientists, and I suppose Nic fits two of those categories. He is a scientist, he's a statistician. He worked with both the Blair and the Cameron governments to try and find a new way to measure the country's progress. So rather than GDP, actually trying to create a happiness index for the country. He's now founder and CEO of Friday, a business which, in his own words, it drove him demented to see what people were measuring in the hope of finding ways to make their teams happier and more productive. So we talk about what's at the heart of his data model and the things that drive productivity. And he touches on why it's important. In 4 years of measuring data across his clients, he's been able to establish that the happiest teams are 22% more productive than the unhappiest. So we chat about that. We chat about a little bit about his former life as a statistician for government. And we talk about what his business is trying to do to try and enable entrepreneurs to measure something, happiness, to measure that in their employees, because it's something we all feel. So it's sort of a personalized approach to measuring it one employee at a time and then aggregating it at a company level so that people can then do something with it in real time. Fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Nic as much as I did.
Hi, I'm Nic Marks. I'm the founder and CEO of Friday. Yeah, I'm a statistician and I measure slightly peculiarly happiness, and particularly happiness at work.
Why happiness? Why measure happiness?
I'm interested in people's experience of life, and sort of throughout my career, I've got frustrated with the fact that we try and measure people's experience sort of objectively by what they have or what they do rather than how they feel. And so it's been an iteration over sort of a couple of decades of work really that I've actually landed on probably asking people how happy they are is probably the best way of measuring their experience of life.
Why do you think that's true? Particularly in work context, because you can ask people loads of different things. And so why happiness?
I think that it certainly has to be an emotional element of the experience. In the sense, as human beings, we are emotional beings as well as cognitive beings and physical beings. And if we start thinking about any experience, then we very quickly come to some sort of gut feel about it. So I don't know if you've ever read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow book, but he talks about system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. And the system 2 thinking is the more deep thought, and the system 1 is the more emotional way of coming to it. And any situation we find ourselves in, we make a very quick snap emotional judgment. So you meet someone for the first time, I like them, I don't like them. It's roughly right normally. And that's a lot of the way that we assess every sensation experience we have. Is it pleasant, unpleasant? Is it good, bad? And happiness is a pretty good way when we ask a catch-all question to people to get into that strong good, bad situation. You know, if you're happy at work, it's going well. If you're not, you're not. And it's also very firmly located in the individual as their own experience, whereas often in workplaces, we ask people their sort of perceptions of something outside of their control. So in many sort of performance reviews, you sort of ask people vaguely about someone's skill in leadership or something. Well, you don't really know, but I do know that I like working with them, I don't like working with them. That is very strongly located in me. So if you're going to get subjective data, I think you should get ones that people are experts on, and we're experts of our own emotional experience, our happiness.
What's your view of appraisals?
Obviously, feedback is good in the organization. And I think, in fact, I'm with Daniel Pink. Daniel Pink once said that the workplace is one of the most feedback deprived places in modern world. That is a 10-year-old quote, and we probably are getting better at it. But an annual appraisal or 6-month appraisal really misses out on most of the nuances of work. So I think having little and often is a better approach. And we see the world of work moving more agile, moving more into weekly, fortnightly sprints. And I think actually if we're going to do appraisals, we should be sort of slightly always on it, but then we need to be really light touch. Light often, I think, is better than heavy infrequently.
Well, there was a piece of research that I was reading from Gallup, and basically it could find almost no evidence for a performance improvement doing annual appraisals. And in fact, it said mostly that there's a downside, and therefore you may as well not do it because at least you'd get the time back. So at least managers wouldn't be spending all that time and employees wouldn't be spending all that time doing it. I suppose there are two things that clients or companies I visit never say. Nobody ever says the management over communicate, and nobody ever says my boss praises me too much. So I'm with you on the sort of feedback desert thing. It's very rare. What brought you to this though? What brought you to measuring employee happiness? Like, what length of journey are we at the end of when this is your life's work now?
Well, it's the beginning of act 3 of my life, probably.
Right.
If you have everything's a 3-act play, isn't it? Act 1 was studying and university, and I did mathematics and then became an applied statistician. I wasn't a pure mathematician at all. I was very interested in real problems, and not to say that mathematicians don't solve real problems, but they're in the 14th dimension and no one else cares about them. And I was much more interested in problems that people solve. And so I became a social statistician really in my 20s. But my mother was also a family therapist, and I got interested in therapy. And so rather unusually for someone with hard skills and statistics, I started to get very into people skills and understanding people. And over time, this morphed into thinking about quality of life. So my first published work there's 94, and then into well-being. So, you probably heard the well-being word used quite a lot in business, but in governments, it was started to be used about the year 2000. And I was working in the policy world. And I ended up creating indicators of well-being, started working with the Blair and then the Cameron governments on how they could structure indicators of experience of life and well-being. And I kind of just progressed that work a long way. I did a TED talk about my work in 2010. And then I thought, okay, act 3, what am I going to do next? And, my dad had been a business guy. And so I was always interested in business. And I thought, well, we could apply these things in business. And so in 2012, 13, I started to really think about how could we apply the ideas around happiness and well-being in the business context. And measurement was going to be the key to the door, in that business is a metric heavy world. Numbers speak in business. So let's create numbers about intangibles so people can talk about them better. And with my therapeutic hat on, thinking that actually you're always trying to bring into awareness. That's what you're trying to do when you're a therapist. You're trying to get the client to understand the situation better. And a system is a client just as much as an individual. So how can the whole system become more aware of the internal experience of employees? And so using the numbers to open that door, but then actually how do we build happier teams, happier organizations to follow that through? So it sort of became a logical conclusion, but yeah.
Well, going back to your work with the Blair and Cameron governments, what were you measuring and to what end?
When I started the wellbeing program at the think tank New Economics Foundation, I started with a question, because I think questions are more powerful than answers, they open space questions. And so I start with the question, what would policy look like if well-being was its aim? It turns out that's quite a profound question, because it's difficult to know what lots of policies are about. What are they trying to do? They're trying to promote economic growth, but why are they trying to do that? Or what are they trying, local diversity or this or that? And actually, I believe, although this is still a mainstream idea, though there is still talk about the next spending review will be a well-being focused one, but basically well-being should be the unifying principle of people's experience of life. And of course, economics matters for that massively. Inequalities matter for that massively. So you can start getting into a lot of policy debates using that term, but being much more inclusive. So I was advising them particularly on how they structure indicators. You can be quite simple about it. You can be more complicated about it, more in depth. And so we work with local governments, we work with European statistics agencies, creating comparable indicators across different countries, different languages. And we worked campaigning really for the government to do more of this, which in 2011 the Cameron government committed to measuring well-being nationally, and they do now nationally measure well-being.
What are they measuring? How are they measuring national well-being?
So you ask people in surveys structured questions around their experience of life. So in much the same way that people ask about mental health in a sort of context of negative experiences in people's life or negative thought patterns, you talk about happiness and well-being. One is you can create overall judgments about your life, like how happy are you with your life nowadays as a standard question. You can ask about anxiety, loneliness, other things as well that draw towards it. So in the national indicator set, they have 4 questions on life satisfaction, on happiness, on anxiety, and on whether you feel your life's worthwhile and meaningful. And they're trying to cover a spectrum. And I mean, they wouldn't be exactly my choice of 4 questions, but that's what they ended up doing.
And is that where people sort of say, right, we're measuring gross domestic happiness? Was that because they do that in Bhutan? Was that when people were trying to suggest that that's what Cameron was doing so they could poke fun at him?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it does provoke comic response amongst some people, which I think is rather sad. You know, like when Blair started talking about this, they said, oh, Tony wants you to be happy. And, you know, it's sort of like, well, surely, you know, we've got it there in the American Constitution. Surely the happiness of the population is an important aspect. I mean, isn't that how we judge our own lives? And I think it's because people thought that it was prescriptive towards it, you know, like you're sort of telling you to be happy and, you know, but actually really all that government can do is create conditions for positive experiences to merge out of it or negative experiences. And why shouldn't they be tracking that? And businesses are the same, really, in the sense it's a context and an environment that people have patterns of relating and behaving with each other out of which arise experiences.
If you could increase the national happiness of the United Kingdom, is there a tangible benefit? Because I can see how it works in business, but is it to prove the government's doing a good job, or is it?
Well, I think that should be one criteria. But I mean, if you really want to think about it, then we know that happier people live longer. So if the government is interested in the health of the nation, so happier people live, you know, 5 to 10 years longer than unhappy people. So that's actually it's a bigger impact on longevity than body mass index or smoking. If we're interested in reducing, you know, the burden of the unhappy well, you know, physically, mentally unhappy, physically well, though whether we can make that differentiation particularly on the health service is massive. So, you know, if people became happier, there'd be less burden there. There'd be more community spirit. People would live better lives, you know, so that's got to be good. And then, of course, we can look into, when we get into business, we can look into productivity, creativity, retention, all those sort of things. So, you know, if we look at the UK statistics on productivity, which are pretty miserable over the last 20 years, then a happier population would actually almost certainly be a more productive one.
And do you have any sense of happiness and political affiliation, or maybe happiness and social media usage? Or
political affiliation is a really interesting one because very broadly, if you're on the right, you tend to be happier than if you're on the left. And this is when you've held for everything else. You've held for income, you've held for marital status, you've held for other things in your life. And probably that's because the right are more happy with the status quo and the left are less happy. And we include that in our own happiness. So if you sit sort of, you know, to the center left, you're probably more worried about some social things than possibly you are if you're on the right. And so that's where we tend to find the stats go. And whether that's helpful, I don't know, because, you know, there is a slight correlation. It's like we have it with religiosity, that people who go follow religion are slightly happier than people that aren't. And that's even holding for community, because they tend to be more bedded in community, so they have more social relationships. But there is something probably very comforting in believing that there's a God looking after you and that there's some afterlife, you know, and that those of us like me who are agnostic at best and probably atheist if I think about it seriously, then, you know, actually I don't have the comfort of thinking about, you know, that I'm going to go to a better place, because I actually think I'm in the better place right now.
Better make the most of it.
Yeah.
Okay. What else makes you happier? Yeah, I was just thinking about the general population, because I'm surprised already by the sort of left-right split. But
it's a kind of annoying finding for someone of me. We shouldn't expect the data to all be benign. I mean, you can see, you know, racial tension in the data and things like that when you look at subjective data like fear of crime and level of crime, then some of that gap is explained about, whether you trust your neighbors, and then that becomes dependent on ethnicity mix and all sorts of things. So there's bits of it which, actually in the Brexit debate and everything, you could probably see if you did a very nuanced well-being indicator, you'd see that coming more. And I don't mean to put that into a racist concept. I mean to put that in the context of unhappiness in the population, because clearly the vote to leave is coming from a deeply unhappy place for a lot of people. And actually that's been disrespected. And that's about rising inequalities as much as anything, and falling opportunities. And people have a reason to be angry, and that's absolutely fair from their stance. And it's sort of missed. I think that's where there's a fair critique of the sort of political elite, and also if we think about it, that's why I like statistics. Look, I'm from a educated middle-class elite. My statistics keep me more real, because if you read the statistics carefully, it challenges your biases.
Yes. And did Cameron stop that work? Or was there a change of government and Theresa May decided happiness was no longer on her agenda?
So Cameron had some flagship policies in his first government, about big society, about well-being. And of course, Brexit has just dominated the debate over the last government. But big society got slightly quietly parked. Well-being started to get more into there being well-being officers across sort of PCTs and other implementation programs. There was starting to be some more systematic measurement, but it's slightly waned. It's become more marginal. Like if you're comparing two policies, well-being starts to come into debate rather than a sort of fundamental, how do we think about that? But it's some progress from where we were. But I think whenever you work close to the policy arena, you end up feeling quite frustrated with it, I think.
Okay. So here you are working in business instead, hoping to be less frustrated. What's the science behind happiness at work?
We have a measurement element, which is, it's not trivial, but I think it's easily solvable, the measurement thing, which is we ask people, our strong opinion at Friday is, Friday's the name of my business, by the way. On a Friday, we ask people how happy their week was. So the unit of measurement is an individual. The time we ask is over a week, because people's experience of work ebbs and flows very quickly. So it should be a very responsive indicator. And we ask them their happiness because that's locating it firmly in their own experience. If you ask people, how engaged are you at work? People can't give you an answer.
They don't know what you mean.
It's a does not compute. Yeah, it's a does not compute answer. Computer don't know, whatever that expression was. It's like, so clearly engagement is in the organization's agenda. They want people engaged because they want people to be more productive. It's kind of a code word for productivity. But if you ask about people's happiness, it's like, actually, how can we give you a good job? How can we create the conditions for you to thrive? That's really what we're trying to do, is actually measure people thriving. And happiness is very much the best way of asking that question in a week. And then you get a really nice ebb and flow. People have, of course, they're not happy every week. That's part of the ebb and flow of life. But if teams particularly have 2 or 3 bad weeks, there's probably something systemic going on there. There's not just a bunch of individuals with a head cold. There's something going on. So there's something to intervene there. So the one insight is about the measurement, which is about measuring happiness, measuring it regularly, consistently. So we call it happiness KPI that measures the experience across every team in the organization. And, both team leaders should be interested in that, and senior leaders should be as well, because they see how everyone's faring. And then the other thing is really understanding that human beings, we're very social. We're very socially motivated. The reason that if you want to lose weight, going to Weight Watchers is a great idea is because of the group element of it. You get together every week, you weigh yourself, you talk about it. If you try and do it on your own, it's always hard. And happiness at work is the same. It wants to be a group goal. And so we very focus on teams as being the sort of vehicle of positive change in organizations. It's very proximal to where people work. And so how do teams have a discussion every week, going back to that performance review? This is not something you save up for once every 6 months or an away day every year. It should be 10 minutes every week. How was last week? What's gone well? Any frustrations? And really pick up on that and really agilely move towards creating a better experience for everybody.
Do the survey on a Friday, review it on a Monday in the team.
Yeah, so basically the data goes 2 ways. We collect on the Friday, and we ask how happy were you, ask any successes you want to share, anyone you want to appreciate in the team, because, someone else, you want to shout out for someone else, you've got any frustrations. And so the first 2 are very positive. The third one is obviously a challenge. And then on a Monday morning, the team gets presented back to them what their response rate was, what their happiness score was, the successes that people want to share, which gets everyone to go, yay. And it's like, as you said, people don't feel appreciated enough at work, and actually just be able to share those small wins is good for us. And there's nothing to be ashamed about that. We all want a bit of positive strokes, The appreciation works really well because, if I say to you, thanks, Dominic, for something you did, you feel good because you're thanked. I feel good because I thanked you. And everyone else hears about it and they think you're a jolly good fellow too. So it's like it really builds a momentum around it. And then the frustrations are there to be discussed seriously. With that positive energy that you've got from bonding a team better, you can meet your frustrations together. And it's just incremental changes.
Do you then track the frustrations and changes, or how are you using the data to help the organization focus on the things that can fix stuff for everybody?
That's at the team level, and sometimes cultures are very micro cultures in a way that some teams can in an organization can be functioning really well, some struggling, but then you've got the whole system pattern as well. And so that for that we talk about a sort of learning feedback loop, which is slower. In fact, we rather playfully call these two learning feedbacks feeling fast and thinking slow. And that is in homage of Kahneman's thinking fast, thinking slow. But the feeling fast is the weekly team one. But the thinking slow is a sort of HR senior leader learning loop, which is basically analyzing the data that comes up from the weekly team meetings, and it's planning on how to interpret those and act differently. And that's partly about understanding the key drivers of happiness at work, which is a lot of research we've done over the last 5 years, and helping pair the data on that. So we tend to supplement that very brief Friday survey, or pulse if we want to, check in with a quarterly culture profile, we call it, which is 15 questions. So a bit more like the Gallup Q12, if people are familiar with those, where you ask about the sort of drivers of it.
Do you get into whether people perceive that the work that they're doing, because look, you could sit down and watch Netflix and it might be enjoyable, it might make you happy, but it's sort of a bit pointless. Do you get into whether people feel that the work that they're doing is meaningful, or that they buy into the purpose of the organization?
Absolutely. So we talk about there being 5 ways to happiness at work.
Right.
And those 5 ways cover that space. So the first one is connect, which is that relationships are sort of the cornerstones of happiness and positive experience, or negative. They both work both ways. This next one is be fair, which is about being respected, work-life balance, appreciation. The third one is empower, which is about autonomy. It's about using your strengths, about being able to be yourself. The fourth is challenge. So it's about stretch, creativity, learning. And the fifth is inspire, which is the meaning worthwhile one. So are you proud to work at the organization? Do you feel your work's worthwhile? And really that spread, which is if you can make a sort of Maslow's hierarchy out if you want to. I don't think these things are hierarchical. I think they're network systems. You could think of Daniel Pink. Daniel Pink talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Mm-hmm. Those are the last 3. Americans tend to be a little weak on social. They tend to underestimate how socially motivated you are, and that comes the first to connect, and then social is also about social justice as well, and fairness in an organization. So they tend to be a bit weak on those. So it's about looking at it systemically.
And so are you able, because I think certainly the stat in my head, if I remember it correctly, is 85% of your perceived engagement at work is as a result of your manager. Do you tease that out in the team-by-team scores? Or do some of those other happiness scores, are they as a result of your sort of team leader, supervisor, manager as well?
I hadn't seen such a high stat on that. What I do know is that experience of work is very proximal. It's very close to you. So in that sense, it's more immediate than it is from, say, senior things. So possibly if you're looking at a correlation between satisfaction with senior leaders, satisfaction with your line manager, and your satisfaction, you might find that this one is 8 times stronger than the senior leaders. I haven't looked at that stat, but that is an empirical question that you've just posed, and one could measure it. I think it's to do with the work you do, is to do the work, the people you do it with, and that's to do with your manager and to do with the organization. So there are layers to it, really. People can be fundamentally unhappy in life, and they're not likely to be very happy at work then. And it's true. People bring their unhappiness and happiness to work, and actually they bring their unhappiness from work home, or their happiness from work home. These boundaries they call them spillover effects statistically, and you can measure those spillover effects, and we find them both ways that they both do. So there's something that's about you, but there's an awful lot about how we work together. And I think we all know that. We've worked in happy team environments and unhappy ones, and we know fully well that the happy ones are much better.
And so when you've done this research over the last 4 years, you've compared your data model, I guess, with other things. I see a lot of people I meet measuring what they call ENPS, and they're just asking, how happy are you at work, 0 to 10? They're taking NPS and just applying it to work.
I kind of hate that measure. The ENPS tends to be, would you recommend this place to work? And so it's very externally focused. Basically, it's about brand ambassadorship for the organization. And of course, that's helpful for talent attraction, and it looks good on Glassdoor, wherever else you're looking at it. So it's an irrelevant question. It doesn't respond very quickly to immediate situations. So we use, happiness much more. And as I say, we frame it in the weekly. People also do use things like Gallup's Q12, where they're basically trying to measure engagement. But if you'll notice with Gallup's Q12, the questions, none of them ask about engagement. They're all asking about drivers of some hidden construct, which is engagement. Yeah. They can't do any statistical separation between means and ends, which as a statistician was always drilled into me. You've got to look at your outcome variable, you've got to look at your inputs, and how do you do the relationship between them. So they can't really tell you out of their 12 questions which one is driving engagement more, because they're saying engagement is the sum of the 12 questions. Whereas when we use our 15 questions on those 5 ways, 3 for each, then we can tell you precisely which ones are driving the happiness in your organization, which ones we find are driving it most in your sector or in the whole population. So I'm quite convinced ours is more robust, but I'm obviously going to think that, otherwise I wouldn't be advocating it.
And does that, because when I've done Gallup, you do think about it as a pyramid, and so the first one is around, I know what's expected of me every day, and you're saying your model basically says in your business and in your sector, you might want to start here. This is where we'd probably see the biggest outcome change for input variable change.
We have algorithms that start running through your data that create what we call an impact report, and they're basically using data from we've done some big representative samples of the US, the UK, other countries as well, about 8 countries, well actually about 15 over the last 5-6 years, but we're looking at how sectors perform. But then we've also worked with clients for a long period of time now, so 3 or 4 years we've got data series of every month or every week asking clients questions, because we played with the cadence over the years. As we came to settle on it being weekly, we played with other cadences like daily, monthly, fortnightly, and we've settled on weekly as being the best way, not just making it up, but looking at how people use it.
And why Friday in the week?
So the working week, people tend to work in a week sprint, particularly white collar office workers. It's a unit of work. And it's an episode. It's strictly speaking, it's called episodal measurement. At the end of an episode, you ask how it was. So like you go to film, how was it? So you've done your week's work, how was it? And so we ask at the end. Now, there are some statistical biases that come in that. There's one called peak end, which is that you're more framed by what's happened at the end of the week than the beginning of the week. And that's true. But actually, I think that's okay, because we work in a week sprint. And if you're happy at the end of the sprint, that's got to be good. If you're unhappy, you really haven't got what's done in the week or whatever. And also then you take that unhappiness home for the weekend. So I think I would argue it has more of a negative impact on negative externality on people's lives. Mm-hmm. If you go home unhappy on a Tuesday night, you probably talk to your partner, go for a walk, and then Wednesday you can fix it. If you take it home Friday, actually this happened to me just last week, actually, I got an email I didn't want to receive at 6:30 on a Friday, and we had a bank holiday. And today, so it takes you a long time to get back to be able to solve that problem. Of course, I did a lot of thinking and ruminating about it over the weekend, but it's actually much more intrusive than if that had happened on a Monday, because I'd have sorted out the next day. So I actually think the week is a good way. We've looked at monthly, which works okay. You definitely forget the first couple of weeks. But then if a team has a bad month, you don't know whether that was just a bit unlucky and next month they're better. But you've got to wait a whole month for that data. Yeah. If a team has a bad week, you can look next week whether they've recovered. And really resilience, people talk about resilience. Resilience is bounce back. And statistically, you can measure that by looking at the shape of the curves, team by team, division by division. So it gives you immediate data, immediate feedback that you can act on as a senior leader if you need to, and as a team leader.
And when you look at your clients and their long-term data set, can you take that link between happiness and productivity?
Yeah, you can. And retention. Retention we have very good data on, because effectively we've got a list of all the employees in our clients and we know who leaves. So we can retrospectively look at that. So we know, for example, that if a team, we ask on a 5-point scale, and if a team moves half a point up, then they have 17% lower retention the next quarter. Lower turnover, sorry,
Right.
higher retention. Basically, you leave because you're unhappy, and it's quite quickly that people will start looking for a job, if they're not happy, and if something comes up, they go. So you see that very, very quickly in the data that unhappy teams have higher staff turnover. The productivity, for getting organizations, one, to measure productivity at a team level, and two, to share that with us is more difficult. But what we know from our research, so we've got some data on performance reviews, we've got some data on productivity, is our estimate of it is that happy teams are at least 22% more productive than unhappy teams. That's the figure that I can feel confident of statistically is roughly right. Big impact.
How do you then do the cutoff then between happy and unhappy?
So we're looking there at what's called quintile groups, which is looking at the top 20% compared to the bottom 20% of the teams that we see. So rather than having an absolute definition of what's happy, but in a sense, we do have an absolute definition of what's happy, because when we get people to respond to a questionnaire, we ask people, are they very happy? Are they happy? Are they okay? Are they unhappy? Very unhappy? And we color code those greens and yellows and oranges and reds. And so we know that in the green is happy roughly, because that's what people are saying they are. So we do have some base there that's just firmly in the data, but it becomes a little bit difficult if you've got a team of 10 and 6 people are happy and 4 okay. Is that a happy team? Is it, you get a little bit into those things, so you use indexes to get your way around that. But what we definitely know is that the happiest, i.e. the top 20% and the bottom 20%, have this very big difference in productivity.
Yeah, and then the organization gets that data on a team by team basis. And so you've got that early warning around churn, because staff churn is just so hard, expensive, takes a long time, impacts the whole organization if you've got a team that has high churn.
It impacts customer satisfaction. If you're a service-based organization, product development, it impacts everything. So instead of trying to think sometimes in terms of what's the lifetime value of an employee, people talk about the lifetime value of a customer all the time. It's obviously related to how long they stay and how productive they are when they're there. And so if you increase happiness, you improve both of those indicators. People stay longer and they're more productive. So you're definitely massively increasing the lifetime value of an employee if you improve happiness. It's probably a squared effect.
Yeah, well, I remember looking at some data from Nationwide Building Society a few years ago, and they looked at the revenue to the building society based on the length of time a financial services person had been in the branch, and their productivity or their revenue per head went up year after year after year after year after year. And so, because then it starts to be looking at where's our churn? Is it the older, more productive people who've got big networks, or is it earlier on? But if you can fix it, then it just, as you say, just has that massive exponential effect over time.
There's not really any losers about happiness. No, losers are bad managers. It is exposing to poor management styles, the data. And so people who are threatened by it, will be worried about whether they're good manager.
Does your data, other than pointing out the bad managers in the organization, it gives them some things that they can go do?
Yeah, totally. So I don't think anyone tries to be a bad manager.
No, I just like you are.
Well, we don't try to be bad parents, but some of us, you want to be a good manager, I think. But people don't have the support or training, or they've been promoted for their technical skills rather. So they become accidental managers. So I think there's all sorts of innocence in there too. However, people get frightened of having conversations about people's experience of work. And they get worried because things sort of fester, things stay there and they get worse. And they feel like if you don't talk about it, it feels like a Pandora's box situation. You're going to open something up, there's going to be lots of nasties in it. One is, things are rarely as nasty as you think they're going to be. 2 is, putting light on anything tends to kill most of the bugs, because you just illuminate it, you do it. And if you do things little and often, they don't build up. If you express a frustration and it's dealt with, that's a win actually, because people feel heard and you've done something about it. So it's really trying to get the frustrations early. Our grandmothers were right. A stitch in time does save 9. And it's really a stitch in 9 philosophy, and that's what our whole weekly discussions are based on, is talk about things early, catch them early and build on that.
Yeah, I'm definitely a proponent of that sort of daily huddle, weekly meeting, monthly, quarterly cadence. What's your aim here, that either as an individual or as a business? What is it? Is it 1 million people, 1 million businesses, raise the gross domestic happiness of the United Kingdom, the world?
So my personal aim, so I been committed to well-being and happiness for the last 20 years, 25 years experience of life. And it's a big enough problem that it will keep me occupied for life. And I did decide to switch into work because I thought, well, how do you reach adults from policy? You can't reach them because you can reach them through the tax system, which isn't very helpful. Though, to be honest, governments do sometimes try to say, give a tax break for getting married. It's some sort of proposition that marriage is better than non-marriage. And I don't know. But that just seems to be a very weak indicator because people will pay a lot to get divorced. So I don't believe that a small tax break for getting married is going to do anything. But you really can't reach adults. So, there's through the health service when people are ill. As you get older, there's that younger, it's education. But in the middle, really, people are at work. So if you're actually going to reach the happiness of the population, I think work is the best platform through it. So in that sense, in my grandiose scheme of Nic Marks' impact on the world, I'm like trying to make a happier world of work because that makes a happier world. But then for the business, I just got so fascinated with how rubbish I think other people's statistics are. And, it really annoys me. And so I just think I'd like to build a really successful business, shows people the right way to do it. And obviously part of that is creating the economic engine for business to grow and do that. So I've become more interested in the commercial side, but I'm really a product developer. But I fully understand that for this product to be used, it's got to be sold. So it's like, how do you do that? So we don't have key statistics on exactly how many, but I do know that the market size is absolutely huge. There's 31 million people at work in the UK. There's another 90 million, 100 million in the US. That's a lot of people. It's a little bit more difficult for us with blue collar workers who don't have email or don't have a smart device that they can contactable for. So we possibly won't immediately be factory settings, context for people. But if you just look at the service white collar base, there's a lot of people who are blooming miserable at work. And I think they would be a lot happier if their teams were more functional and they, had work they could thrive in.
Absolutely. And go home happy on a Friday. Take that spillover effect and don't kick the wife and punch the cat and take the kids to the park.
Yeah, it is about that. And it's like, and there is a balance there. And I mean, the great thing about this, and I realized pretty soon, is it's a win-win-win. I mean, there's even data showing that organizations with better cultures do better on the stock market. 3 to 8%, depending how you measure it. Probably it's more the low end of the spectrum, actually, because of biases and the way that some researchers have done their work. But it's definitely 3 to 4% extra. I mean, Warren Buffett would be very happy with those type of extra returns, yeah? So, the only losers are people who are committed to a sort of managing by fear with huge egos sort of people. And I don't really want them in the workplace anyway, so I don't mind annoying them.
Good. Nic, if I could ask you for some book recommendations, what along the way have you read that you think other people should read?
Well, I've mentioned it a couple of times. I think Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I think he is a really very interesting thinker, Kahneman. And I think he could be a little bit more emotional in his connotations of it, but it's very clear, interesting thinking about it. God, I read quite a lot at the moment, so it's hard to know. I mean, I loved Sapiens, if you've read Sapiens.
Yeah.
And Homo Deus afterwards, and was a little scarier. Did you read Homo? Did you read Homo Deus?
Yes, I did.
I like these people who are big thinkers like that. If we're looking for a straight book on happiness, and this is for personal happiness, then I would certainly recommend Paul Dolan's new book, which is called Happily Ever After, I think it's called.
Okay, because his other book was called Happiness by Design, wasn't it?
Yeah, Happiness by Design. But the second book, I think, is even more interesting. It's not really new research, but it's a really interesting narrative, which is what sort of myths are we peddled in life and how do they stack up against happiness data? So, getting married, working hard, how do these stack up against it? And he basically debunks a lot of the myths of Western life and says we should concentrate more on our experience and listen more to our experience. And I think that's very worthy, very good. That's my favorite recent happiness book, but of course there are classics in there. I'm a bit struggling to think of others, not just because I haven't thought ahead, but
no, that's cool. That's cool. I think that's enough. Unless you've got another one on the tip of your tongue.
Well, I love that book, and I'm trying to remember its name, but I think it's the whole new organization one where they were looking at the different categories of redesign, reimagining organizations. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name. It's some French guy.
Yes. Frederic Laloux.
Very interesting. I didn't like some of the slightly new agey bits of it, but I liked the whole context of it. And I guess that's where I sit as someone trying to raise organizational consciousness in that way.
Okay. That's brilliant. Thank you very much for those recommendations. As if there's certainly Paul Dolan's new book I haven't read yet, so I'll jump on and get that. And if you were to go back in time, knowing what you know now, is there a point in time where you'd like to go back to? You could have more impact, or waste less time, or have more fun. I don't know.
I've had my challenges in my personal life, like many of us. And I think if there's a theme, as a person I'm a pretty happy chap. I tend to be very smiley. I tend to be very positive. And actually, this is actually against this. It's saying that sometimes I think that happiness, you can override signals with your sort of positive outlook. And so I think for other people, it's often the opposite way. But for me personally, I think I could have listened a little bit more to some negative signals a bit earlier in my life and acted on them a bit more. And in a sense, that's the Stitch in Time Saving 9 philosophy coming back, which is that I think we should take feedback from the universe seriously. And I think probably, if I think in my first marriage, I think, I should have noticed signals earlier. I overrode them thinking it'll be fine tomorrow. And then once you work out tomorrow's been going on for 5 or 6 years, it's a bit late, So I think that's what I think that's been my advice to my younger self would be, just watch out a little bit.
Don't let your inbuilt optimism get ahead of you.
Yeah, and I think that actually I hadn't expected to be sort of getting towards the end of the podcast on this point, but it is a serious point, which is that we have to understand that happiness is about optimizing rather than maximizing, and that going around smiling all the time, you're probably missing things. But it is more about, the happiness of knowing that you can respond to challenges, the happiness that you can, that you feel capable and you've got efficacy in the world and you can act in the world. And there's much stronger, more resilient happiness that comes from that, rather than a sort of purely sort of slightly ungrounded one, which I'm sure when I was young, I probably annoyed people just sort of. It's actually what my statistics has been very good for me. It keeps you grounded all the time. And so that's why I get very interested in them.
That's brilliant. Nic, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All this information and more can be found at dominicmonkhouse.com/podcast. There you'll find show notes, additional reading and links related to this episode. You can also find my blog and the past editions of the Melting Pot newsletter. The simplest thing to do is to sign up to my subjectively not crap once a week newsletter, where I'll update you on what I've been up to, the most interesting articles I've read, and all things relating to scaling up, high-performing teams, net promoter score, company culture, etc. Social, you can find me on Twitter at Dom Monkhouse and LinkedIn at Dominic Monkhouse. LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach me and share your questions and comments. Thanks for listening.